The year 2022 marked the 350th death anniversary of the 17th century Zen Master Yinyuan Longqi, Ingen Ryuki in Japanese. Today's event is one of a series of commemorative events which began on May 3rd, 2022. These events present and explore the extraordinary life of Zen Master Yinyuan and his great achievements of the tradition, the traditions he pioneered, the Huangbo Chan tradition in China, and the Ōbaku school of Zen Buddhism in Japan. These events highlight the intersection of religion, art, and culture in China and Japan. Activities include an online exhibition of works of art related to the Ōbaku tradition. You can see these at ingen.arizona.edu. Academic lectures, musical performance, and tea-related events. We are fortunate to have two events this week. Tomorrow, we will have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Elizabeth Horton Sharf, who's here with us today as well, one of the curators of the online exhibition, on how to read Ingen's portraits. So please join us once again tomorrow at 4 p.m. here at the Union to hear more about the artwork connected with this Buddhist tradition. This lecture series is made possible thanks to the generous support from Wanfu Temple in Fuqing, Lingyin Temple in Hangzhou, and matcha.com. For more information about our lecture series, please visit our website at cbs.arizona.edu. So, before beginning, I would like to thank the online host for our event, Dr. Robert Gordon, a fellow of the Center of Buddhist Studies and assistant professor at the Fred Fox School of Music in the College of Fine Arts. I would also like to congratulate Dr. Gordon on his recently published book, Buddhist Architecture in America, Building for Enlightenment. He will be our point person for the online attendees, one of whom there are many. I'll turn it over to Robert for a moment to say hi and to explain how to ask a question if you are attending on Zoom. And then I will introduce our guest for today's lecture. So Robert, do you want to say hi for a moment?
Welcome to everybody. Yes, my name is Robert Gordon, and I'm here hosting the online portion. If you do have a question, I'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll be taking those down in order as they have been received, and we'll be forwarding them to the speaker. We are looking forward to this event. Me particularly, I'm a big fan of Dr. Sharf's work on Chan Buddhism, and I think we're all in for a real big treat. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert. So Dr. Robert Sharf is the D.H. Chen Distinguished Professor in Buddhist Studies in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of California at Berkeley. He also serves as chair of Berkeley's Numata Center for Buddhist Studies. Dr. Sharf works primarily in the area of medieval Chinese Buddhism, especially Chan, but he also dabbles in Japanese Buddhism, Buddhist art, ritual studies, and methodological issues in the study of religion. As a graduate of Berkeley's Buddhist Studies program myself, I can attest to the ways in which he has shaped the next generation of Buddhologists, delivering some koans of his own along the way. Dr. Sharf is the author of Coming to Terms with Chinese Buddhism, a reading of the Treasure Store Treatise, co-editor of Living Images, Japanese Buddhist Icons in Context, and has written many field-changing articles. I deeply enjoy teaching his work in my courses. For example, in my religious studies methods courses, students enact an iconic debate between Dr. Sharf and Dr. Janet Gyatso on the topic of religious experience. I have been known to preside over the debate in the classroom by channeling the spirit of William James. So many thanks to Bob for laying the foundation for great conversations in the classroom, as well as among experts in the field. Dr. Sharf's lecture today is thinking through Zen Kōans and is related to his current book project, tentatively entitled How to Read a Zen Koan. Many thanks to Dr. Sharf for joining us here in Arizona. We look forward to the Q&A with the audience at the end of the talk.
Thank you, Ray. And thank you, John Woo, for inviting me and everybody else who's been involved in making this happen. So just a few things before I begin. The truth is I'm not working on Chan right now. That book is it's going to be another lifetime, I think. And I explained to Jungwoo when he invited me that I'm actually not working on Chan, but they asked me to do something on Chan because of the nature of this lecture series. So I'm kind of reaching into a project that I completed recently. And I completed it. It was a multi-year project that I was doing with Deguchi Yasuo, Jay Garfield, and Graham Priest. And that's why I want to acknowledge their help on this here. And I'll also say for the title, I'm using Zen as the English translation of Chan and Koan as the English translation of Gongan. And the object today is to demonstrate that it is possible to take koans seriously, philosophically. So there's a kind of common understanding of koans that they're actually meant to somehow stop rumination, to effect a kind of leap into the mystical and whatever, which would actually mean that they don't have any philosophical content themselves. You would then wonder why there are so many hundreds of koans with commentaries and sub-commentaries and sub-sub-commentaries. It was clearly an exegetical or commentarial tradition. And we can talk, maybe in the question and answer period, we can talk about why that particular exegetical tradition was lost through time. But today, my project is really to show you that it is possible to treat koans as a kind of philosophical literature, but koans take paradox seriously. So I'm going to spend the very beginning giving you a really quickie background in the philosophical understanding of paradoxes. It's kind of cutting off the top, but here's a few key terms that philosophers use who actually take, who are interested in paradox. And one is dialethism. And this is a philosophical position that there are true contradictions. In other words, there are some statements that are both true and false. And the sort of technical formulation of that would be P and not P, okay? Very simple. Now, you can see why someone interested in Buddhism, particularly Mahayana Buddhism, would be interested potentially in paradox, because the Buddhist scriptures, particularly Mahayana scriptures, are filled with statements that look, at least on the surface, contradictory or paradoxical. A classic one is from the Diamond Sutra, the Vajrayetika. The Buddha proclaimed that the world is not the world, and hence it is called the world. Okay, so it looks like P and not P. Another one from the Lankavatara. So the Prajna Paramita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, is filled with statements like that. Paul Harrison has called that the signature formula of the Diamond Sutra, but there are many others. This is from the Lankavatara Sutra. Things are not as they appear, nor are they otherwise. Now, there is a way out of some kind of seeming contradictions, and that is something called parameterization. So that would be a way of reading it as P superscript 1 and not P superscript 2. In other words, the P's, the two P's on either side of the conjunction, are not identical. And if you do that, then the paradox seems to disappear. The Buddha proclaimed that the world is not the world, and hence it is called the world. So world is being used in a different sense as we move through this. And if you do that, the paradox seems to disappear. However, there are some paradoxes that you cannot parameterize. And this is the classic one, the liar's paradox. This statement is false. Now, is this statement false? Well, if you're familiar with it, you realize if it is true, then it is false. And if it is false, then it is true. So you cannot parameterize that. That's what we mean by a true paradox or a true contradiction. I shouldn't say true. It is a paradox. It's a real paradox, a real contradiction. You can't make it go away. And it is a version of a class of paradoxes that have to do with self-referentiality. The classic one, this is the one that kind of blew the minds of Russell and Whitehead when they were working on their Principia Mathematica, because they thought that they could provide a firm foundation for mathematics and using Cantor's set theory. And then they ran into this particular axiom, this particular statement: the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, right? Does this set contain itself or not? It's also known colloquially as the barber paradox. It's the barber who shaves everyone who does not shave themselves, right? Does the barber shave himself or not? Now, what's the problem? Why do people kind of run when they begin to smell a paradox or contradiction? There is a real problem, and that's what logicians call explosion. And this is a very simple proof, which I'm not going to give you here, that if you allow a paradox or a contradiction into a logical system, very quickly you can demonstrate that anything you say is true. And that's called explosion. It's a great term. Trivialism is a view, a philosophical position that condones explosion. It says, yeah, that's okay. All statements are true. And it's interesting that there are a few thinkers in the medieval Chinese Buddhist world that seem to flirt with trivialism, both in the Tiantai school and the Huayan school. But we're not going to talk about that today. So for the most part, logicians, philosophers want to avoid explosion. And there's different ways you can do that. I'm only going to mention very quickly two. One is to ban certain kinds of self-reference. This was the route that Russell and Whitehead took. They just said, we're not going to allow self-reference into systems because it mucks it up. But it's not a very adequate solution. Many philosophers think that, well, first of all, self-reference appears all the time in common speech. And if you're interested in phenomena like philosophers are of consciousness or mind or self, you often have to engage with reflexivity. Or there are phenomenologists, for example, who believe that what makes consciousness is precisely that it knows the object and it knows itself knowing the object at the same time. And so on. Higher order thought theory does the same thing, that it's our cognitive capacity to reflect on ourselves as we're reflecting that makes us conscious. So banning self-reference doesn't seem to be a good way to go. Another way is something called paraconsistent logic. Graham Priest, who was one of the co-authors of the book that I mentioned, is someone who works on paraconsistent logic. And that's a logic that can accommodate contradictions without leading to explosion. I'm not going to go into that. But the reason that I'm focusing, or the reason I've given you this background and I'm using it to look at Zen is because, or Chan, is because the Chan people did not think that paradox was a problem. They thought it was a tool. And it really means that Buddhist philosophy, Mahayana philosophy, will move in directions in East Asia very differently than it moved in the Indian and Tibetan worlds. If you want to see the background to looking at paradox in the East Asian tradition writ large, we cover that in this book. Okay, so this is all by way of an introduction, and I'm going to foreground this particular Gong'an, right? The Chan master Yinyuan Weixin of Jizhou ascended the high seat and said, 30 years ago, before this old monk had begun to practice Chan, I saw mountains as mountains and rivers as rivers. Then later on, I came face to face with the teacher and made some headway, and I saw that mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. But now, having reached a place of rest, I once again see that mountains are just mountains and rivers are just rivers. To all of you, I ask, before I go there, I just want to try this. Okay, I encourage all of you, when this is done, go to YouTube and Google Donovan, First There Is a Mountain. This actually, it was a very popular song at the time. And it's based on this koan. Anyways, the koan continues. To all of you, I ask, as for these three ways of understanding, are they the same or are they different? Should there be a monastic or lay person among you who can find a way out of this, I will acknowledge your having come face to face with this old monk. Okay, so now it's not advancing. There it goes. So I want you to notice, first of all, in just very quick background, you'll see that even though this looks like a fun Zen story, it's actually just a Zen reframing of this, right? The Buddha proclaimed that the world is not the world, right? First there's a mountain, then there's no mountain, and hence it is called the world. It comes back. And if you're not convinced of that, it actually is a reframing of a technical Yogacara doctrine called the three natures, or the Trisvabhava, very important doctrine in Yogacara. And very quickly, they are the imagined nature, or padakalpita, which is the conceptually constructed nature. It's the natural attitude. It's the attitude that takes the world that is given to us naively by the senses as being out there. But then there's the dependent nature, which is Padatantra, the nature of all things as dependently originated, and this is the nature of all things as empty. And then there's the fully realized nature, Parinishpana, or the consummate nature, and that's the way the Buddha sees the world, right? And again, these are the mountain, no mountain, and then we can ask, is this the mountain again at the end? Now, I'd point out that there is a controversy over the interpretation of the three natures. And several decades ago, Alan Sponberg wrote a very influential paper in which he said, look, there's two different ways to understand this, and they are not necessarily commensurate with one another. Sometimes in some texts or some sections of one text, they do it in what he calls the progressive model. So you move from the imagined nature to the dependent nature and to the fully realized nature. But there's also something that he called the pivot model. And sometimes this is found in the same text, where the dependent nature is the metaphysical or ontological level, the nature of dependent origination or emptiness. It never changes. You don't move through that, but you move from your perception of the dependent nature as constructed, right? The constructed overlay on the dependent nature, you move from that to the fully realized nature. So it pivots in a sense. What the Indo-Tibetan tradition does is try to figure this one out, right? What I'm going to suggest is there's a paradox hidden in there that was not really seen in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, but the Tiantai tradition absolutely saw it. Because in their reframing of this, they talk about conventional truth, and then there's the absolute truth, right? That's the Buddha eye view of the world. But then in the middle, sort of a pivot, but it's not a pivot, is the middle truth, which is dependent origination, which they explicitly say is the simultaneous identity and difference of the conventional and the absolute. So in thinking of mountains are mountains, realize that this it's a fun little story. You can listen to Donovan do his riff on it, but it actually is pressing against a problem which is fundamental in Mahayana Buddhism. Okay. So now to go back to this going on, we really don't know anything about Yinyuan other than his authorship of this particular public case. It first appears in a Chan anthology dated to 1204. But the anecdote is celebrated in both classical and modern sources as it bears upon a problem, I'm going to argue, that lies at the very heart of Buddhist path theory, and that's that liberation is impossible, and yet it is achieved. And I'm going to use this particular case and the paradox to which it points as an entry into the nature and use of paradox in the single most influential collection of Chan cases, which is the Wumengwan. Right? And even the title of the Wumengwan is dialethic. It's paradoxical. It's sometimes translated as the gateless barrier of the Chan tradition, but it denotes a passageway through which there is no gate, which can mean either that it's impossible to enter, or alternatively, that there is absolutely nothing barring one's entryway. So at first glance, the mountains are mountains is seemingly straightforward. And if there's a paradox there, it's only superficial. And this is the way it's interpreted by almost everybody, right? Virtually all modern commentators understand it as follows. Before you set out on the path, we unreflectively accept the common sense attitude towards objects, such as mountains and rivers, as existing out there in the natural world, right? And this is what phenomenologists following Husserl call the natural attitude. A viewpoint that simply accepts the existence of the world as given to us by the senses. But as you engage in Buddhist practice, you come to realize that the natural world is actually a cognitive construct. Everything we know, everything that can be known, emerges as the result of causally determined interdependent processes. So nothing can be said to exist in and of itself. Buddhism 101. To put this in Buddhist language, everything is causally conditioned, it's samskrita, and hence it lacks own being or intrinsic nature. So there is, in the end, no substantially existing mountain out there in the mind-independent world, and this is what it means to characterize all things, including mountains, as empty. So to say that mountains are empty is just to affirm that all there ever was or ever will be are conventionally existing mountains. In that case, the term conventional doesn't signify anything, as there is no noumenal domain of truth that lies beyond appearances, and hence no intelligible distinction to be made between the phenomenal mountains that show up for us and real ones. So in the end, mountains are just mountains. So when Yinyuan asks whether these three ways of understanding are the same or different, the answer seems straightforward. They are the same in some respects and different in others. The mountains never change. They've always been empty, but the mind changes. The mind evolves in its understanding from an initial naive perception of things as having independent existence to the realization of the emptiness of all phenomena, and finally to the understanding that emptiness is also empty. So objectively, the world remains the same, but subjectively, the Zen adept has come to appreciate the ephemeral and insubstantial nature of the world, and this brings freedom from clinging and desire. Right? So to borrow the language of the Heart Sutra, first you see form as form, and then you see form as empty, and finally you see that emptiness is precisely form. Or in the language of the 10 ox herding pictures, as you progress along the path, you let go of the ox, which is the object of your search, and then you let go of the seeker, the self, and then as well. And this stage is famously represented by this empty circle. But according to the logic of Mahayana Buddhism, you cannot stop there. So the final stage is the ox herding sequence, is the returning to the marketplace with hands open, in which the adept is depicted as a fat-bellied bodhisattva strolling merrily through town. So the seeker is back to where he began, but now free of worldly cares and attachments. Right? Everybody follow this? Because I'm going to tell you that that's wrong. Right? I'm going to tell you this is not the way to understand this going on. So it is then possible to parameterize the apparent paradox in Yinyuan's case using the doctrine of two truths. From the perspective of conventional truth, there's a difference between the way the mountains are viewed at the beginning and end of the path. But from the perspective of ultimate truth, there is not. The mountains remain the same. That's the ultimate truth, the domain of ontology. But our apprehension of, or our relationship to the mountains is transformed. And that's the conventional truth, the domain of epistemology. And there are respected scriptural precedents that could be used to support this reading. I'm not saying that this reading is not a Buddhist reading. I'm just saying it's not a Zen reading, right? So as I mentioned, the Vajracharika makes repeated use of the formula X is not X, and therefore it is X, where X can stand for any existing thing or dharma. And Indian and Tibetan commentators explicitly use the two truths in their analyses of the Diamond Sutra formula. The first half, X is not X, pertains to the ultimate truth of emptiness, while the second, therefore it is X, pertains to the conventional. So commentators can then use Nagarjuna's argument that it is precisely because all things are empty of intrinsic being, right? That's ultimate truth or ontology, that they can enter into causal relations with other dharmas, thereby producing the ephemeral world that appears before us, right? That's the conventional world. So if one follows this line of argument, the paradox disappears. The problem is if it were that simple, Qingyuan's challenge would be vapid. Parameterizing the contradiction by distinguishing between perspectives, ultimate versus conventional or ontic versus epistemic, does not work, because the Gong'an genre is, among other things, questioning the coherence of precisely those distinctions. We'll see that the relationship between ultimate and conventional is itself enmeshed in paradox, and thus the two truths cannot help to diffuse the paradox at the heart of the case. There is no difference between the mountains before and after awakening. Thus, there is no path, no awakening, and no Chan, and it is this understanding that constitutes Chan awakening. Okay? So the seeds of the problem go back to the very beginnings of Buddhist thought. Buddhism teaches that all conditioned existence, or samsara, is impermanent, that there is no eternal soul or self or Godhead, and that the only genuine escape from suffering is the peace of nirvana, which is the cessation of the five aggregates that constitute the person. And early Buddhist scriptures sometimes depict final nirvana as tantamount to death, as death is now understood by secular materialists, right? There's no future rebirth, and hence sentient existence simply ceases. And this led rival teachers to accuse the Buddhists of propagating nihilism, and the Buddhists responded that their goal is not nihilistic. Rather, the question is whether there is something that, the question as to whether there is something that survives final nirvana is undetermined. Right? That's the sort of orthodox Buddhist response to that. And various rationales can be found in Buddhist sources for declaring the issue undetermined, the details of which I'm not going to go into here. However, irrespective of whether nirvana is considered an absence, pure and simple, or whether one imagines that something, however subtle and unimaginable, survives nirvana, or whether one holds that the question is simply wrong-headed, all Buddhists agree that nirvana is unconditioned. It's asamskrita, and hence it cannot be the result of or effected by any cause. The problem then is that activity or karma of any kind, including Buddhist practice, cannot logically bring about nirvana. Anything one does, including trying not to do anything, can only be the cause for a subsequent effect, but nirvana cannot be the effect of any cause. So no activity can bring about the final cessation of all activity. And there's lots of ways in which the early scholastic tradition tried to respond directly or indirectly to this problem, none of which, at least to me, are particularly satisfying. The most familiar response was to simply caution against fretting about it. Right? Nirvana is unconditioned. It lies beyond our conditioned comprehension. So just have faith that the Buddhist teachings will lead us there. This strategy finds scriptural warrant in the famous parable in which a man is shot by a poisoned arrow and a surgeon is called to extract it, right? And in the sutra, they says, what if this guy who's kind of dying there, before allowing the surgeon to remove the arrow, he wants to know the identity of the person who shot the arrow, his caste, his name, his clan, his village, and the nature of the bow and arrow that were made, what kind of wood was the shaft made out of, and what kind of bird did where the feathers come from, and so on. He said the person's going to die before the surgeon ever removes the arrow, right? So the Buddhist teachings are simply a means to an end, to use the common one, the raft across the river of samsara, or in an image popular in East Asia, the Buddhist teachings are likened to a finger pointing to the moon. So understanding entails looking not at the finger, but at the moon to which it points. It is counterproductive, according to this line of thought, to ponder inconsistencies or contradictions in the teachings, since the teachings are, in the end, mere expedient devices leading to a goal that transcends conceptual understanding. Now, you might find this satisfactory, but many Buddhist exegetes did not. And they continued to wrestle with it, reworking their doctrinal formulations and interpretive strategies, right? And in fact, I would argue that much Mahayana philosophy came about as a response to this particular conundrum. So the doctrine of emptiness, for example, holds that all dharmas are devoid of intrinsic being, rendering the distinction between conditioned things and unconditioned things moot. If the nature of everything is empty, then there's ultimately no distinction between conditioned samsara and unconditioned nirvana, and hence there is nothing to attain. This claim is made repeatedly and forcefully in the early perfection of wisdom literature, as well as in Madhyamaka exegetical materials. The Vimalakirti uses the language of non-duality, insisting that there's no difference between ignorance and awakening, impurity and purity. And the Tathagarbha text insists that since Buddhahood, or the unconditioned, cannot be attained, it must already be present in all beings. Ergo, nirvana is not attained, it is disclosed. And there are significant differences, of course, in the way these doctrines are fleshed out, but they all address the seemingly insuperable gap between the mundane and the supramundane, the conditioned and the unconditioned, or samsara and nirvana, by maintaining that there's ultimately no gap to be bridged. But these important strands of Mahayana thought solve one problem, but simply to generate others. If everything is empty, if Buddhahood already abides within, what stands in the way of our recognizing this? If there's ultimately nothing to achieve, why practice in the first place? And finally, if everything is empty, doesn't this apply to the teachings of the Buddha as well? So these questions motivate the formulation of the two truths found in chapter 24 of Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karikas. In the first 23 chapters of this seminal work, Nagarjuna is intent on showing that nothing has any intrinsic or substantial nature. So chapter 24 opens up with the interlocutor raising the following question. He says, if nothing exists in and of itself, if everything is empty, then can't the same thing be said of the Buddhist teachings? Aren't they empty too? Right? And this is the formulation. Sorry, it's hard to read there. If all this is empty, this is the interlocutor talking in the Karikas. If all this is empty, there is neither origination nor cessation. So it follows for you that there is the non-existence of the Four Noble Truths. So comprehension, abandonment, practice, and personal realization, none of these is possible due to the non-existence of the Four Noble Truths. So this is somebody saying, if everything is empty, then the Buddhist teachings are empty too. Why should I listen? So in other words, in the interlocutor's mind, the Buddhist teachings, the Four Noble Truths, the stages of liberation, the three jewels, and so on and so forth, should be subject to the same critique that Nagarjuna applies to everything else. This is standard stuff, although I'm going to give you a non-standard way of reading it. So Nagarjuna begins his response by insisting that the interlocutor makes a mistake in equating emptiness with non-existence. He says, here we say that you do not understand the point of teaching emptiness, emptiness itself, and the meaning of emptiness. For Nagarjuna, end quote there, for Nagarjuna to claim that something is empty is not the same as claiming that it is false. He then goes on famously to give us the two truths. Okay, so here's Nagarjuna's response. The Dharma teaching of the Buddha rests on the two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth. Those who do not know the distinction between the two truths do not understand reality in accordance with the profound teachings of the Buddha. The ultimate truth is not taught independently of customary ways of talking and thinking. So not having acquired the ultimate truth, nirvana is not attained. Okay? Simple. So in other words, the conventional way of using language, the language associated with the natural attitude that unreflectively accepts things as they appear, is required to convey ultimate truth, the truth of emptiness, the standard. For Nagarjuna, emptiness is precisely dependent origination. As there is nothing that is not dependently originated, there is nothing that exists in and of itself, and this is what it means to say that things are empty. Dependent origination we declare to be emptiness. It, or emptiness, is a dependent concept. Just that is the middle path. There being no dharma whatsoever that is not dependently originated, it follows that there is also no dharma whatsoever that is non-empty. So much of the remainder of chapter 24 is taken up with the argument that the Buddhist teachings, and indeed the path itself, only make sense in the context of emptiness. The truths of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, for example, all presume a world in a state of constant flux, and the Buddhist path can lead to the cessation of ignorance, suffering, and samsara only insofar as things lack self-nature. To assert emptiness is then not to claim that things are false or in existence, but rather to claim that they exist codependently. Okay. That for those of you who know, this is standard, right? Here's the problem. This response only works if one exempts the doctrine of dependent origination from the logical thrust of Nagarjuna's dialectic. To put this another way, how does the claim that all things are dependently originated fit within the rubric of the two truths? Is dependent origination itself conventionally true or ultimately true? This is not trivial. The two truths doctrine holds that the teachings of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, the Three Jewels, and so on, are conventionally true because they are commensurate with and lead to the ultimate truth of emptiness. This is what distinguishes them from the conventional falsehoods taught by the heterodox non-Buddhist teachers. But the ultimate truth to which conventional truth points turns out to be the truth that anything one says about the world must be true conventionally. So we're now up against the limits of thought's paradox. Right? The doctrine of two truths cannot be asserted ultimately, since the ultimate does not brook conceptual distinctions. Right? Properly speaking, the ultimate cannot be a truth claim or a perspective or a view at all, as that would entail being one among many. Hence, it would seem that the two truths doctrine itself must belong to the domain of the conventional. Indeed, the whole point of Nagarjuna's reductio ad absurdum arguments is to demonstrate that nothing can be asserted ultimately, including the claim that nothing can be asserted ultimately. So this leaves conventional truth as the only truth left standing, in which case the conventional truth that there is no ultimate truth is as true as it gets. So we have, in other words, a reiteration of the signature formula from the Diamond Sutra, right? X is not X, and therefore it is X, right? The ultimate is not ultimate, and therefore it is ultimate. But now we can't use the two truths as a conceptual tool to parameterize our way out of the contradiction, since the two truths themselves are contradictory. So we haven't resolved the paradox at all. We simply relocated the paradox. So in sum, I'm going to get to Zen in a minute. You can see where I'm going with this. The Zen people got this. They realized that there's a paradox sitting at the very heart of Mahayana thought. So in sum, Nagarjuna offers the two truths as a means to situate the Buddhist teachings within his understanding of emptiness and dependent origination. He draws a distinction between conventional and ultimate, or between finger and moon, and then he claims that the Buddhist teachings are provisionally true by virtue of the fact that they point to the ultimate. But if ultimate truth is the truth that all truth is dependent, we're left with no stable point of reference, no non-conventional foundation on the basis of which we might distinguish between the conventional truth of the Buddhist teachings and the teachings of his rivals. The claim that the truth of any statement is context dependent and hence only relatively true must apply to the statement that all statements are context dependent and only relatively true. So the two truths turn out to be paradoxical, and thus to use the two truths to tame the paradox in Yinyuan's case simply kicks the can down the road. Now, there's been a lot of debate. How am I doing on time? I guess I'm okay. There's been a lot of debate lately about whether Nagarjuna himself explicitly endorsed the use of paradox in his writings. I don't know if you look in the literature, Jay Garfield has gone against Tillemans on this issue. In any case, what is clear is that later Madhyamika commentators in India and Tibet did everything they could to avoid paradox. Right? In Indo-Tibetan scholasticism, to condone paradox was tantamount to condoning incoherence, much as it is in contemporary Anglophone philosophy. But China was a different story. Chinese Buddhist commentators were steeped in the paradoxes of Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu. They not only recognized the limits of thought paradox in the two-truth formula, but they ran with it. Now, Chan came out of the same intellectual milieu as did Tiantai, and both can be seen as responding to the logical conundrum created by the two truths. The Tiantai folks, as I mentioned, they read chapter 24 of the Karikas as proffering not two truths, but three, adding a middle truth that sublates conventional truth and ultimate truth. And some people see this as a philosophical advance, certainly Brooks Aporin does, as it allowed the Tiantai thinkers to distinguish conventional wisdom, which is the middle truth, from mere conventional falsehood, and therefore it provides a foundation for ethical thought and action. And Brooke has done a lot of very good work on this. But the Chan tradition refuses to move in this direction. From their point of view, simply proliferating truths just exacerbates the muddle. And one of the founders of Southern Chan, Shen Hui, said, quote, this is Shen Hui, "There is only the middle way, and it too is not the middle, since the meaning of the middle is predicated on the basis of the extremes. It is the same with three fingers. It is only by virtue of the two fingers on either side that we can posit a finger in the middle. If there are no sides, there's also no middle finger." So Shen Hui is claiming that the conventional and ultimate are themselves codependent, and that the label conventional is meaningful only in relation to the label ultimate and vice versa. And being relational and hence empty, the two truths cannot be construed as independent positions or perspectives between which or across which one might locate a middle. Whether Shen Hui's polemics do justice to the conceptual sophistication of the Tiantai position or not is not my concern here. My point is simply that the Chan tradition refuses to mitigate or resolve the contradiction that lay at the heart of the two truths doctrine. Right? So that contradiction is the doctrine itself is the doctrine itself conventional or ultimate. Right? So they embrace it. And this meant rejecting any attempt at mediation. This is going to be important for the way I approach the Wuming in a second. Any attempt to circumscribe a third position that resolves or transcends or sublates the antinomy is rejected. Now, one possible mediating stance might be the stance of silence, in which one refrains from speech altogether, so as to avoid positing any view, perspective, or truth. And some koans do in fact depict Chan masters, like the Greek philosopher Cratylus or the Buddhist sage Vimalakirti, resorting to non-verbal gestures. So in response to their students' challenge to say something real or something true, right? This is always the challenge, right? Something not conventional. Huangbo was famous for hitting the interlocutor, Linji for letting out a shout, Zhuzhi for simply raising one finger. Yet should their students mistake these actions as pointing towards some inexpressible truth, as fingers pointing to the moon, they are immediately chastised. So take, for example, case 3 in the Wuming Hua. Right? Whenever someone challenged Zhuzhi with a question, he would simply hold up one finger. Later, an acolyte was asked by someone outside the monastery, "What is the master's essential teaching?" And the acolyte also held up his finger. When Zhuzhi heard about this, he took out a knife and cut off the acolyte's finger. The acolyte cried out in pain and ran out, but Zhuzhi called him back. And when the acolyte turned his head, Zhuzhi raised his finger. The acolyte suddenly understood. So the acolyte's transgression, of course, was mistaking the finger for the moon, which is why the master cuts it off. But an absent finger, the refusal to signify, the posture of silence is just as contextually dependent as is the shout or the strike or the wordless finger or any other attempt to resolve the dilemma, which is why the case ends with the master raising his finger at the end. There's no escape, in other words. The same point is driven home in case 6 of the Huangbo, in which Shakyamuni, instead of preaching a sermon, simply holds up a flower. Oops. The elder Mahakashyapa alone smiles. Everyone knows this story, the so-called flower sermon. You may think it's a cool story. It indicates his understanding that the Buddha responds by acknowledging his transmission to the elder. But Woman doesn't think it's a cool story. Woman says, right, instead of celebrating the Buddha's skillful teaching, in his commentary, Woman castigates the Buddha as a swindler who offers his audience dog's meat and calls it mutton. What if everybody smiled? Woman asks. Who then would Buddha have transmitted the Dharma? Right? So silence is no less conventional. It's no more direct. It's no more sublime than any other signifier, which is a point driven home in Hakuin's famous koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping? So the attempt to circumscribe a third medial position or non-position that resolves or sublates the paradox, or that signifies by refusing to signify that which cannot be signified, whether through mute gesture or knowing silence, is rejected as futile and misguided. Rather than trying to insulate the tradition from the force of its own deconstructive dialectic, Chan holds back nothing. Woman calls the Buddha a swindler. The sixth patriarch Huineng is depicted tearing up the sacred scriptures. Yunmen likens the Buddha to a dry shit stick. And Linji famously declares, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. There's no special pleading, no special dispensation for expedient teachings. So it would seem then that the transmission of the Dharma is impossible, that speech and silence both fail. And yet, in saying this, I've transmitted the truth of the matter. The paradox, as at the heart of so many Chan cases, is drolly illuminated in Huangbo case number 5, the man up a tree. Okay. Master Xiangyan said, "It is like a man in a tree, hanging from a branch by his teeth, with his hands unable to reach a branch, his legs unable to reach the trunk. Under the tree is a man who asks why Bodhidharma came from the West. If the man in the tree fails to reply, he shirks what is being asked of him. But if he responds, he loses life and limb. In this situation, how would you respond?" And then this woman's comment on this is, even should your eloquence flow like a waterfall, it is of no use. Even should you preach the teachings of all the scriptures, it is still of no use. Should you find a response to this problem, you will bring life to a path that had previously been dead and kill the path that had previously been alive. Otherwise, you must wait for the coming of Maitreya and ask him. So to really get this case, you have to know what any literate monk would know. Namely, there is a obvious answer to, why did the Indian patriarch Bodhidharma travel to China? He traveled to China to transmit the Dharma. Right? That's given. It's the same way in case 1, when someone, does a dog have Buddha nature? The case only makes sense if you know the right answer, which is yes, all living things have Buddha nature. But the moment the man in the tree opens his mouth to respond in this or any other fashion, he falls to his death. So the man under the tree is asking for the moon, the true Dharma that Bodhidharma brought to China, but to respond in any fashion at all is to offer a finger. So Xiangyan is saying that transmission of the Dharma or the moon is impossible since all we have are fingers, But this very truth is the moon, and hence the case succeeds in transmitting the Dharma. That's why Bodhidharma came from the West. So Bodhidharma's transmission of the Dharma to his one and only Chinese successor, Huike, is itself the subject of case 41 of the Wumenguan. And this famous, but obviously apocryphal anecdote begins with Huike waiting patiently outside Bodhidharma's cave, hoping to catch the master's attention, with the snow falling, piling up around him. And finally, in an act of desperation, Huike cuts off his arm and presents it to Bodhidharma. That's what he's doing here. And he says, "Your disciple's mind is not at peace. I beg the master to put my mind at peace." And Bodhidharma says, "Fine, give me your mind and I'll put it at peace." And Huike says, "I have searched for my mind, but in the end, I'm unable to get hold of it." Bodhidharma says, "There, I put your mind at peace for you." So in this paradigmatic Chan encounter dialogue, Bodhidharma pacifies Huike's mind by showing him that there is no mind to pacify. Huike gets it and becomes the second patriarch in China. Okay, so you're probably with me so far, but you probably have this objection. Right? The temptation is to resort to a distinction between conventional and ultimate, between epistemology and ontology. There must be some difference, however conventional, between those who understand that there's ultimately nothing to attain and those who have not yet come to this understanding. There must be some difference between Huike before the transmission and Huike after the transmission, even if, from the ultimate or ontological perspective, the point of the story is that there is no mind that stands in need of enlightenment and thus no enlightenment to be gained. What could be more central to Buddhism in general, and Chan in particular, than the notion that practice leads to or discloses wisdom, the Buddha mind, and that this wisdom is transformative? And yet, the moment one asserts these venerable Buddhist truths, the moment one claims that there must be something gained through practice, whether ultimately or conventionally, Wumen will respond that nothing is attained, either conventionally or ultimately. So look at case 11. I love this case for American Zen practitioners. It says, Jiaozhou came upon a hermit and asked, "Have you got it? Have you got it?" The hermit held up his fist. Jiaozhou says, "Oh, the water is too shallow to anchor a boat here," and he went on his way. He then came upon another hermit and asked, "Have you got it? Have you got it?" And the hermit also held up his fist, and Jiaozhou says, "Able to give, able to take, able to kill, able to save." And he then paid obeisance to him. So this is key. Wumen then comments. They both held up their fists in the same way. So why did he affirm one but not the other? Tell me, what is the problem here? If you can give a single turning word to clarify this, you will see that Jiaozhou's tongue has no bone in it, now helping others up, now knocking them down with great freedom. Be that as it may, Jiaozhou was himself thoroughly examined by the two hermits. If you say there is a difference in attainment between the two hermits, you do not have the eye of practice. If you say there's no difference in attainment, you do not have the eye of practice. Okay, so this case is a trap into which you fall if you believe there is something behind Jiaozhou's approval of one hermit and his disapproval of the other. Wumen declares that Jiaozhou's choice is arbitrary. He says Jiaozhou's tongue has no bone in it, and he approves of one and disparages the other with great freedom. Right? Dazizai. A term that references the unconstrained and unconditioned activities of a Buddha. Jiaozhou is thus free from any investment or attachment to achievement or non-achievement. Right? He just approves one, doesn't approve of the other. But to claim that there is no difference between attainment and non-attainment is to establish a medial position. Right? This is what they don't do. They're not going to say there's no difference, because that's the medial position. And this is precisely what Zhao Zhou does not do. He mischievously denigrates one hermit and acknowledges the other, thereby enacting his freedom from positions in the very act of testing the hermits, which is not to say that Zhao Zhou has something that the hermits lack. It's not like he's got freedom and the hermits don't, because note that Wumen flips things around and he says, it was the two hermits that saw through Zhao Zhou's ruse, and they're the ones who are actually doing the testing. So now who has it and who doesn't? And the same point, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go through this one. How am I doing for time? Do you want? Yeah. Okay. So I will skip the next one, except to say that it's exactly the same going on, right? There's two monks roll up the blinds. They do it in exactly the same way, and the master affirms one and denies it to the other, right? So I'm just going to end with this last Gōan, because this I really think nails it. So we've seen many of Wumen's cases are rather cryptic, leaving it to the reader to tease out the paradox at the core of the anecdote. But case 2 of the Wumen Gōan, Baizhang Huihai's wild fox, foregrounds the paradox for all to see. And this case is particularly salient for our discussion as it deals directly with the problem of liberation, with whether final escape from karmic conditioning and rebirth is possible at all. So whenever Baizhang delivered a sermon, an old man always followed the assembly in order to listen to the teaching. When the assembly left, the old man left too. Unexpectedly, one day, he remained behind, and the master asked him, "Who are you standing in front of me?" The old man replied, "Indeed, I'm not a human being. In the past, in the time of Kashyapa Buddha, I lived on this mountain as a Chan teacher." The term mountain and monastery are being used interchangeably here. On one occasion, a student asked me, "Is a person of great accomplishment still subject to cause and effect or not?" I answered, "He's not." And because of my answer, I was reborn as a fox for 500 lifetimes. I now ask you, Master, to say a transformative word on my behalf to free me from this fox body. And he asks, is a person of great accomplishment, that would mean a sage, a Buddha, still subject to cause and effect or not? And the master said he cannot evade cause and effect. Upon hearing these words, the old man immediately understood, makes a bow and says, "I've now been released from the fox whose body remains behind on the mountain. I presume to tell this to you and now request that you perform a funeral for me as you would for a deceased monk." That evening, after performing the funeral, the master convened an assembly and related the circumstances of the funeral. Huangbo then asked, he's a disciple, the old man failed to respond correctly and was reborn as a fox for 500 lifetimes. Suppose that time after time he made no mistake. What would have happened then? The master said, "Come closer and I'll tell you." And Huangbo approached Baizhang and gave the master a slap. The master clapped his hands and laughed, saying, "I had supposed that the barbarian had a red beard, and now here is a red-bearded barbarian." Okay, so let me just quickly unpack this. Buddhist doctrine holds that Buddhist practice leads to nirvana, to freedom from causation, and to escape from the karmically determined cycle of life and death. Hence, the orthodox response to the initial question would seem to be that the person of great accomplishment, an awakened sage, is indeed free of causation. Yet precisely because he gave this doctrinally sanctioned response, the old man found himself bound to the cycle of life and death, still in samsara. The challenge is to respond in a manner that does not reify causation or liberation, that does not confuse the conventional with the ultimate, and at the same time does not posit a medial or transcendent position, right? Like a perspective from which you could neither affirm nor deny causation and liberation. Baizhang responds by asserting the inverse of the old man's response, saying that even an awakened person cannot escape causation. Right? This is the same thing Jiaozhou does in case one, the dog koan. So Baizhang's claim that there is no escape from karma is tantamount to declaring that there is no final nirvana, no Buddhahood, no end to life and death, no freedom. And this answer, the assertion that there is no freedom, frees the old man. So the paradoxical structure could not be more explicit. If you claim liberation is possible, it's not. If you claim it is not possible, it is. There's fun stuff that happens at the end of the story. I'll skip it. If people want to ask me in question and answers, it's the whole interaction with Huangbo is fantastic. But anyways, so to conclude, Wumen understands that there is no ultimate position or perspective or point of view, since ultimate truth can only be the truth that all truth is context dependent. Again and again, following impeccable Mahayana scriptural precedents, Wumen asserts the identity of nirvana and samsara, of wisdom and ignorance, of freedom and entrapment. And he does this not from the perspective or standpoint of the ultimate, since there is no ultimate perspective to be had. This is Wumen's point. His cases are traps intended to catch the unwary student who imagines some transcendent ground beyond the vagaries of contingency and conception, a final escape from life and death. There is no stepping outside, no view from nowhere, no escape from causality. This is the truth of emptiness, the realization of which frees one from causality. Rather than running from this dialetheia, Wumen runs toward it. He holds nothing sacred. He does not distinguish between the truths of Chan and the mundane truths of everyday life. There's no special dispensation for Chan skillful means. Chan is nothing special, and this, of course, is what makes it special. So to return to where we began, when Qingyuan asked if the three views of the mountains, those at the beginning, the middle, and in the end of one's practice are the same or different, it should be clear that Qingyuan, like Wumen, does not want to avoid the paradox. He doesn't want to avoid the dialetheia, but he wants to rub your nose in it, to assert that they are different in any respect, to maintain that there is anything to attain, either conventionally or ultimately, is to fall from the path. But at the same time, there must be a difference. If awakening were not an achievement, there would be no path from which to fall. There is nothing to be attained, and when you see this, you have attained something, both conventionally and ultimately. So everything is left precisely as it was before, and everything has changed, conventionally and ultimately. So if what one attains is the understanding that there's nothing to attain, if Chan is nothing special, why should one practice Chan in the first place? And this, of course, is the subject of another Gong'an. This is case 16. Yunmen said, "How vast and wide is the world? Why put on the seven-piece robe at the sound of a bell?" In other words, of all the possible things one might do with one's life, why choose the rigidly regimented life of a monk? Yunmen provides no rationale. In the end, there's no rationale to give. There is no non-empty moon by which to determine that one finger is better than the other. He puts on his robe because the bell sounds. Thank you.